All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Robin Marty. Robin is the senior political reporter for RH Reality Check, which you can find at rhrealitycheck.org. She is also the co-author, along with Jessica Mason-Piclo, of the new book, Crow After Roe, How Separate But Equal Has Become the New Standard in Women's Health and How We Can Change That, which you can find at crowafterroe.com. Robin, thanks so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me back, Matt.
All right, so Robin, let's start out by discussing the Supreme Court case that essentially established the precedent of separate but equal when it comes for women's health. Tell us, after Roe versus Wade, where exactly did that idea come from?
Well, Roe versus Wade, as we all know, was about 40 years ago, and this is the 40th anniversary of the decision. For a long time after that, anti-choice advocates were trying to come up with cases that they hoped could try and provoke a challenge to Roe. But their most successful way of actually managing to get abortion restrictions to pass was in 1992 when Planned Parenthood versus Casey came about. And Planned Parenthood versus Casey was a set of regulations that were happening in Pennsylvania that basically it had parental consent, it had all of these different guidelines as to when you were allowed to have an abortion in the first trimester. One of the things that was found there in Planned Parenthood versus Casey is that you cannot ask a woman to ask her husband to give permission before she can have an abortion. That was found to be an undue burden upon women if they're seeking out abortion. So Planned Parenthood versus Casey was the first case that decided that you can restrict abortion in the first trimester as long as you do not put what is known as an undue burden onto women seeking out the procedure. Ever since then, pretty much every abortion regulation that has happened since then has tried to see how far they can stretch the idea of an undue burden. And what might be an undue burden in one state might not be an undue burden in a different state. So some of the things that we're looking at in the book are, here are these different laws that are trying to shut down clinics, that are trying to add extra long waiting periods, that are trying to make women go through certain procedures or counseling before she has an abortion. And are these undue burdens?
But just the whole idea of the way that case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey was decided, just the wording in the decision about about this whole idea of undue burden, it's so broad in a lot of ways that is what the all types of figures on the right are using, that language and that reasoning to exploit that, and actually to try to pass all these, to not just try, but to actually pass all these laws all around the country.
Well, in essence, that's what Justice Sandra Day O'Connor ruled when she disagreed with Casey. She said that when it comes to an undue burden, we've basically underwritten the entire law that was established during Roe, because anybody can say that this is an undue burden, this isn't an undue burden. And so what may be an undue burden for one person, especially one person who has access to wealth, access to a car, access to a doctor, it may be an undue burden for a woman who is poor, or a woman who only has Medicaid insurance, and so she'll have to pay for her abortion out of her pocket because there's so many restrictions on it. So in essence, what it's done is, since you have an undue burden standard, you have to prove that it's an undue burden standard for all women and not just for a subset of women. And this subset of women, unfortunately, are women who are poor, women who are in rural areas, and so they don't have the same access to clinics that a woman who lives in a city and has 3 different choices might have. Or women who are of color and will go in and they'll be questioned about why are they seeking an abortion? Are they looking for a race-based abortion, because in some states that's illegal now. Women who are of color are more likely to be poor. They're more likely to be on Medicaid, so they're not able to use insurance to cover their abortion procedures in a way that other women are able to. So in essence, by setting up this undue burden standard, it's not necessarily an undue burden for women who have resources, but for women who are poor, women in rural areas, women who are of color, this is an undue burden for them, and more of them are finding that they have to give birth because they don't have any other option.
And so the book then goes on to explore a lot of these cases that pop up. The book has chapters on 12 different states. Let's start out with one that's near and dear to my heart, and I know yours as well, the state of Nebraska. It's the first chapter in the book. Let's talk about how a lot of these things actually kind of kicked off in our home state.
Nebraska was, in essence, the original push for these, and most of these restrictions have come since 2010 and since we had the Tea Party wave of elections. Because
actually, let me stop you real quick. Why is that? Why did this and then we'll get to Nebraska. But why? That was actually a question I wanted to ask too. Why after 2010 did this stuff really ratchet up? Because it obviously has.
Yeah, there's two different reasons. The first is the fact that the election of the Tea Party wave, because frankly Democrats didn't bother to show up for the election, the people who were voted in, they were elected based primarily on a really passionate opposition of Obamacare. And so we're finding out now, as we're seeing these legislators longer and longer, that they said that they were running because they're fiscally conservative. They said that they were running because they're adamantly against government control over any sort of healthcare decisions. But in essence, what they really were is they were people who were recruited. And they were recruited because they weren't just against government-controlled healthcare. They were against government giving any sort of intervention for birth control, for abortion access, anything like that. And so they've come into certain states, and as you'll see in the book, it's a key handful of states that are making all of these rules. Since 2010, I believe they've said 600 abortion restrictions have been proposed. Of those, about 200 have actually passed. They're all passing in the same 15 to 20 states. They're not passing everywhere. They're passing in states where the Tea Party has taken control, where they have controlled both the House, the Senate, and the governor's house. And if you don't have all three of those, then you're not getting the same set of restrictions that are happening in other states. And that's where Nebraska fits in, because Nebraska was the perfect storm, because since Nebraska is just a unicameral, it doesn't have the two bodies of government that all of the other states would have. Nebraska also has a very, very tight Nebraska Right to Life, which is the Nebraska section of National Right to Life Committee. And so almost every legislator in the state has some sort of link to Nebraska Right to Life. So when their 20-week ban, and to be clear, because we need to actually talk about this sort of language, this is a 20-week ban that is 20 weeks post-conception. So as we think of pregnancies and dating pregnancies in the standard talking about it, this would be 22 weeks gestation. This is important because later we'll see bans that go even earlier than that. So when they proposed this, they proposed it for a couple of reasons. One was because they expected that they would get a challenge right away, because Nebraska has one of the few later-term abortion providers in the country. But they also proposed it because they knew it was going to go through right away. They knew they had a governor who would sign it into law. And because they didn't have to worry about a House version and a Senate version, they knew that it would go through exactly the way that they proposed it. So they had their 3 days of debate. They went back and forth on it, but each time it was just approving it over and over again. And each time it was just them talking about how wonderful it is that they're going to save all these little babies from fetal pain, or how this is a good first start for banning all abortion altogether. They passed it through. They expected that Leroy Carhart would challenge it, and he didn't. And that was the one thing that was really surprising to those who oppose abortion, is the fact that they thought they would have a challenge right away. They thought they would have a case they could take up to the Supreme Court, and it didn't happen for years.
Why didn't it happen?
Why didn't it happen? I think there's a couple of different reasons. I think that Leroy Carhart was a little bit worried about the idea of being the face of yet another piece of Supreme Court lore, as it will. Leroy Carhart is the Carhart in Carhart versus Gonzalez, I think it was. And so he is the man who challenged the idea of what the anti-choice people call the partial birth abortion ban. And it was because of a procedure that he does when he provides later-term abortions, which are usually done in cases of fetal anomaly, issues with the woman's health. But that law ended up going to the Supreme Court, and it ended up being upheld simply because they came up with a rule that said that there is never a time in which an abortion of that type could be used to save a woman's health. I don't think that Carhart necessarily felt like he was ready to go for another trial, especially another trial that was going to take years again. And his original plan was that he was going to move across the river and into Iowa and just open his clinic, like literally 20 miles down the road. That didn't end up happening because Iowa ended up proposing the same sort of bill in order to try and keep him out of there. And they actually went one further and tried to do one specifically on the city that he was planning on moving into. So it just became too cumbersome. He still has a clinic out in Maryland, and he still performs out there. But it did take one provider out of Nebraska that is usually a Midwestern center that a lot of women who have these pregnancies that aren't going to come to fruition usually go to, and now they have to seek other places.